Hi everybody, welcome to another episode of Sessions with Paola. If you haven't subscribed to my channel and this is your first time here, please subscribe. And if you know anybody that can use this information, please share with them. So today I have the pleasure to introduce Carissa Ford. She is the new addition to Life Discovery Psychotherapy and I'm super excited to have her. Carissa is a bilingual and bicultural therapist, mom Mexican, dad African American. Carissa believes that feelings of anxiety, depression, shame, and trauma can cause much of today's life struggle. She aims to assist clients in understanding the root of these feelings and tackling them as a team. She has extensive experience working with adolescents and adults battling mental health and substance abuse. And as a bicultural clinician, she aims to work with individuals who find themselves dealing with struggles that can impact marginalized communities. She's passionate about the work that she does, and it is on her path to grow her practice here in the city of Miami. So welcome, Carissa.
Thank you for having me.
Of course. So let's start with what inspired you to be in the field of psychology?
The only thing I can remember since like 8th grade, it just came upon me to just read psychology books. I don't know where the calling came from. I felt kind of nerdy because of it, but ever since 8th grade, I just wanted to read books on psychology and it just stuck. And I've always had just a natural, I don't want to call it a gift, but I think
Call it a gift. Call it a gift.
Yeah, I think it's like, I don't know how religious you are or spiritual, but anointing. Like I just naturally had a way of telling people kind of how to navigate their problems, or people would come and tell me things. Like my teachers would just come and tell things to me.
Wow.
And I always knew why people did what they did. And I was like, this is interesting. So I just kind of stuck with it. It's like, not to bring up Forrest Gump, but like a duck in water. Sorry.
Yeah.
But that's how it is for me.
Tell me about that analogy of Forrest Gump.
Sorry, that's my favorite movie, one of my favorite movies. It just comes easily to me. Like he says, a duck in water, it just goes smoothly. So
I love that, Carissa. And I, when I met you, or I remember I was trying to find someone, and I remember I'm like, there's something about Carissa. There's something about this person that there is just something about them. And I think when you talked a little bit about, which is one of my favorite parts of my job, guys, and both of our jobs, to always find an explanation for that behavior. It is beautiful to be able to do that, because I think in our society, sometimes we get so caught up in the how. How do I not think? How do I not feel anxious? And I always say, the only people that don't feel anxious are the people that have no pulse, right?
Yeah.
How do I? So I think this idea of curiosity, a lot like my story, I think curiosity and reading those psychology books, right? Is there anything that you found? Is there anything that kept you interested?
I thought it was interesting why people do the things they do. There was an example I found, and I still think of it today. People will take longer when they know you're waiting for your parking spot when you're reversing out of the parking space.
Interesting.
It's really kind of bizarre. Like they'll take longer if they know somebody's waiting. They did like an experiment and they found that people actually on purpose, I don't want to say on purpose, excuse me, but ironically would kind of take longer, when somebody was waiting for them. And if nobody was waiting, then they would just reverse out of the parking. So
and we all know what that feels like, especially here in Miami, that is getting busier by the minute, and we're all looking for that good old parking spot. Awesome. Tell us a little bit. So, Carissa, in this channel, I really like to tackle culture and race and all of these things that are happening in the world. And when I think of our communities, right, Latino communities, Black communities, what do you think is the stigma around seeking mental health treatment?
Well, I can definitely tell you in the Black community, it's kind of like I want to say in some aspects, and I can only speak for myself and my family, but it's considered like, and also my friends that I have that are African American or will consider themselves African American. They could be biracial, but it's like a weakness, considered a weakness. Like my immediate family, I can say there's members in my immediate family that would never go to a therapist. They just wouldn't consider it. And they would consider you kind of weak, so to speak, if you go to therapy. And even like my elders, when they grew up, as they say in the old days, they handled their problems. You're not supposed to go to a third party or seek a third party to handle your problems or to process, what you're going through. And then in my Hispanic part of my family, they're a little bit more open with the women.
Mom is Mexican,
yes,
correct?
my mother's Mexican.
Okay.
So she's more open, but the males, absolutely not. It's like a machismo. I don't know one male in my family, whether it be my tios or just anybody, they don't go to therapy.
Yeah, well, sometimes you hear, well, why don't you go to church? Why don't you pray more? God or Jesus is going to help you out. Or men don't go to therapy, they go to the barber shop, right? So I think there's a lot of also messages in movies and shows. And I think when we think a little bit about that weakness, I'm Colombian and I run into that too, where our definition of strength is kind of like, you got to keep it moving. And it doesn't matter how you get there, right? Like if you got to get from point A to point B, even if your knees are scratched, even if you're hardly gasping for air. And, and I wonder, I also think that there's a couple of things that come up for me. I mean, history and also even misdiagnosing. There was a really interesting study, Carissa, where they were looking at how white teens were perceived. And so they're irritable, they may be depressed, right? And they found that with African-American teens, they're irritable, they're acting out. And, this is such a big topic that always just frustrates me and makes me feel really helpless when I think about it. But how many of our, of our Black youth is incarcerated because they started with maybe a diagnosis for ADD, maybe depression, maybe trauma. Don't even get me started on trauma. Yeah. Trauma obviously, contributes you to acting out. You act out, you end up in the juvenile system, and eventually incarceration happens. And I wonder, there's your family members, you run into this because you have family members that are like, they may still think that therapy is a weakness. What would you want people to know in these communities to help them understand that this space is safe, that that we're working really hard at representation? For me, that's super important to have in my practice, because the reality is that this started with psychoanalysts, and most psychoanalysts were white old men, right? So it's like, how do I know that you're gonna understand my experience, right? Like, and there's so much trauma when it comes to the history of our Black communities, that it's like, you're sitting there telling a therapist that you're feeling like, oh, there's a lot of people looking at me. Well, is this paranoia? Well, no, there's some truth to this, right? And I think in many ways we've gone a little bit backwards, but I wonder, what would you want people to know to if they're so close to making that step, but they're like, any points that you would want them to know for them to feel more comfortable calling someone like us?
Yes, the biggest thing that's helped me, because I have to admit I was a little bit resistant myself, especially as a therapist. Therapy? Yes, especially as a therapist.
Listen, I can totally relate to you because, I've been in this field for a really long time, but when I was working with the foster care system, which nearly killed me, it was such hard work, but nobody really talked about therapy. It took me going to Boston, where there were some programs that you could not be a therapist without having your own therapy.
Oh, wow.
Which we don't really, when I was practicing down here, and this was a long time ago, you guys, that wasn't the thing. But talk to me a little bit about your own resistance as a therapist going to a therapist.
Maybe it's my family, I integrated that, but I just wanted to handle my own problems. Maybe it's a bit of my ego. Why can't I process things on my own? And also in the past, I used to go to my friends a lot. Yeah. So I'm like, I don't need to go to another person to process, what I'm going through. So it was a mixture. And then I was also worried about what my family would think.
So many layers. And just in this little conversation, guys, look at all of the layers that we have to jump through. What is my family gonna think? What are the messages, because sometimes my dad or my mom still does it today, and I have to correct her every single time, where it's like, well, she goes to my dad, well, you got to listen to the psychologist. And I'm like, no, mommy, I'm talking to you as a daughter, right? Or Paola, but why would you, right? Like go out and like lose your stuff and maybe drink a little bit too much. Aren't you a therapist? That has nothing to do with the other. So for all our therapists out there that are listening to us, it is so important. You're human first. That was your first, right? Then we become a therapist by trade. But just hearing you talk a little bit, Chris, it kind of makes me think about people that want to do therapy, that they do have to challenge some of the familial messages, because other messages are also, no, we don't talk about what's happening in the family outside of there. It is seen as a sign of betrayal.
Yes.
Right? And, I know that you really like working with people, right? Like when we talk about marginalized communities, why is that important to you? And again, what would you want them to know, to make it a little bit, and how did you ever go to therapy?
I think by default,
okay.
I had like a trauma situation, and my position at my job suggested I go. I kind of urged it. And then it ended up helping
so much.
But I only went because of the situation that they were like, this happened to you while you were working, we suggest it. And I was like, why didn't I never go before? But what I would tell, marginalized communities or, individuals that are struggling with the stigma of going, is that we live in different times. The time period that my grandmother lived in, or people in my family that say, oh, we don't do that, we don't have to do that. The times are completely different. Completely different. We're dealing with so many more stressors now, and they're complicated. There's so many variables coming into our brain, into our system, just nonstop. We're in a completely different world. I don't think there's anything wrong with, in this time, just seeking the unbiased third party outside of your family or like your friends that could help you process things. Yes. That's what I would say to people.
Yes, Carissa, and even thinking a little bit, right? Like we live in a city, guys, we live in Miami, where, everybody has a gym membership. People are always trying to look their best.
Yeah.
So I almost think of it like exercise for the mind. And it's something, if you really think about it, what I tell a lot of my clients, this is the only thing that you solely do for you. And this is the only time where you literally stop everything that's happening around you, because that's so hard already, right? Like when do we literally sit with all of the stuff, and what I experience myself being in therapy, but even with my clients, that they sit down and they start crying and they're like, oh my God, Paula, I don't know why I'm crying. Well, because this is the only time that you literally stop, you close the door in the crazy world, and you're sitting with something that you feel, and you're sitting with something that's coming up. And I think for our Black communities, it is so important to understand that, again, the history of trauma, right? Like, and how trauma can really present itself, not only in the way that you communicate for people, relationships, intimacy, and sexuality, right? Like when we think about, and also the history of hypersexualization of women, what we think about Black men. I mean, there's just so much there that why don't you deserve that, right? So I think, and even as you said, when you talked a little bit about, I was kind of pushed, right? Like they told me, hey, you need to go. But as soon as you sat there, you're like, oh, this actually feels really good. And why didn't I do this sooner? Let's talk a little bit about gender roles, right? So when I've worked with African-American couples, and I work a lot with sexuality, a lot of the times there's something interesting that shows up that, he kind of says, well, we're married. So because we're married, we should be having sex. And it's a very, this is kind of like your duty as a woman. So I think that there are some similarities when it comes to Latino culture as well. But what do you see, or how do you see gender roles, and how does that play a factor in communication, sex, intimacy?
Let's see, in my African American family, they don't really mention it as much.
Sex, you mean?
Yes, they don't.
It's
really,
not talked about.
Yes, at least in the male side. But they're still very dominant in their sexuality, I would say, in their expression of it. Maybe just not talking about it.
Interesting.
But they're still very dominant. Like they're very expressive with it, just not in their in their actions.
Would you say, Carissa, how is it expressed?
I would say in their actions.
Okay.
I know that's definitely. I don't know if it's a stigma, but Black men tend to like holler at you more. They're just more expressive, and even if they don't like verbally say something, at least in my family, they're just, when they like you, they're more expressive about their sexuality. maybe not verbally, but they go after the women they like. And then in my Hispanic family, I would say they're kind of more, if they're married, they keep it more private if they are married. And if they're single, they're still expressive, but maybe not as expressive as my African American side of the family. I don't know, as far as therapy is concerned, I don't think that's definitely anything that they, especially my Black side of the family or in the Black community, that's something that they would express in therapy. It's definitely taboo. I think the Black community, as a member of the Black community, needs to be, kind of maybe more open. I know it's a challenge, but to expressing more things in therapy, because there's some challenges there, but we have a lot of stigmas.
Yes.
Definitely.
And what are some things, you guys, I'm a big believer and advocate for people, this idea of what do you have to grow away from, right? Because even my own experience or your own experience, Carissa, that in order for me to be able, to go to a therapist, I had to grow away from, I grew up in a culture where there's a lot of perfectionism. And I think as women, we already deal with some of that. Sit this way, don't get your dress dirty, don't wear that, it's too short. And so there's this idea, and also be independent. That's another super loud message. And so I think, for anybody out there that's thinking about finding a space for them to unpack some of the things that they're going through, it's like, what do you have to challenge? What do you have to say? Nope, that was so-and-so's voice, but I wanna do it a little bit different. And I think also, even though it's hard, guys, I was reading an article of how hard it is to find Black clinicians, right? And so I think it is so important, sometimes it's hard. And with a clinician, I always tell people, listen, you may have to look around, make a call, talk to them, see how you feel in the conversation, right? Because we have so many blind spots.
Yes.
Right? Just like you said, there's so many new stressors, there's so much going on that we can't see everything, right? So when you sit with us, we have a picture of everything that's been going on. I think when it comes, it's interesting to hear you say, the sexuality is kind of expressed in one way. And then thinking a little bit about also the history that we've been socialized to think like, for example, even penis size. Right, like, oh, all Black men, they have a gigantic, enormous penis, and this is what we see in porn. And then what happens when you're a Black male that maybe doesn't fit that criteria? How does that sit with you? And remember that shame lives in silence, secrecy, and judgment. When you give it a little bit of compassion and understanding, shame kind of disappears and crumbles away.
Yes.
Right? When we think a little bit about trauma, anything that comes up for you, Carissa, when it comes to trauma and focusing a little bit more on, communities of color, anything that kind of pops out at you when it says, okay, these are traumatic experiences that I think people could really use help with, or anything around trauma that you want people to better understand?
In relation to the community, I would think in regard to the Black community first, I think there definitely is, not to be repetitive, there's a lot of trauma around the Black history.
Yes.
Yes. Just generational trauma. Still to this day, if I see certain movies, it's painful.
Oh, yes.
So I just think with dealing with a lot of that trauma and integrating yourself into today's times, and how do you process that?
Well, imagine, I'm sorry to interrupt, Carissa, but imagine, right, like, when we think about the history, it's like, people of color's identity was decided for, right? This is who you are, and the helplessness that you feel, and we all, in a little tiny way, maybe have experienced that when we don't feel understood. Well, no matter how much we want to show that we're different, this is what I'm going to decide who you are. So there's a lot of people like, okay, fuck it, this is who I'm going to be, right? Like, this is what the label that you're going to put on me. And so I think we need to better understand, and it drives me crazy because I think in Florida here, we're dealing a little bit with how do we educate, right? And education is in schools. You worked in the school system, and I know that there's a lot of things happening, but I think, it's so important to understand how generational trauma also plays a role. And that trauma literally presses on the brakes of your success, of how you show up sexually, of how you can develop emotionally. Trauma, I really enjoy and love working with trauma because it just makes all the sense in the world when people can say, this is why. Right?
Yes. And, you know, and with the, at least my experience, and I'm sure other members of the Black community can attest to this, you kind of have a defense depending on where you are of like, did this happen because I'm Black? Just, it's weird.
Yes.
It just automatically comes up.
Yeah.
And then
you
also,
say like, so something happens in your environment and you're like, okay, did this you kind of question yourself.
Yeah. And then also, I don't think it's spoken enough. I don't know if there's a biracial community, but I know there is a struggle with certain biracial people that I have met, and as for myself, where you really neither side accepts you or they accept you at different points. So there's a trauma there because I'm accepted to a degree by both sides. So neither side really accepts me 100%. I only have my family who is, we call them Blaxican, my cousins, that I completely feel that's my tribe and we're understood. We kind of stuck together growing up. But when I grew up and ventured away from them, you know, even with the Mexicans, I'm Hispanic to a degree. With the Black culture, I'm Black to a degree, and they, you know, it's still, it's a difficulty. So I think if there is a biracial community, you know, there's definitely stigma there. There's definitely trauma there.
Yes.
There's a trauma there for sure.
Oh my God, and there's so much we can say about that, but I think that, you know, there is this idea of, you know, the word that's coming to my mind, Carissa, is feeling displaced. Yes. And how familiar is that, guys, given all of the history that is true, you know, of that has happened for centuries, right? Awesome, Carissa. Well, listen, thank you so much. And guys, remember that we are the faces of therapy, that you can come to us, that we are here to help. We're currently working on, you know, not only doing individual work, because sometimes, you know, it can be hard to access therapy. Sometimes, you know, maybe you're not insured, or maybe financially it's a big ask, you know. So I'm really working at how can I create more support, whether it's a group for you to say, oh, you know, maybe there are some things that this person is saying that makes sense to me. And for me, I think, like I said, representation is super important. So I'm just really excited, Carissa, to have someone like you, because it is important for everybody. Everybody deserves it. Everybody needs the help, and it's not even need. Everybody deserves. That's what I'm going to leave you with. Carissa, thank you so much for being here with us. And how can people, so she will be in my website soon, guys, Life Discovery Psych. But where else can people find you if they wanted to book a session with you, if they wanted to know a little bit more about you?
You can find me at Psychology Today.
Okay. I will make sure that we post the
just
link.
Put in Carissa Ford, and you can find me. My email where you can reach me is carissa@lifediscovery.com, lfdiscovery.com, Carissa at lfdiscovery.com.
Awesome, Carissa. Thank you so much for being here with us.
Thank you for having me.
Of course.
Thank you.
And guys, I will see you sooner than later. Thank you again for supporting us in all of these talks. I really appreciate all of you. Until next time.